Hello everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of our mini unit on discrimination dealing with race. So last video took a look at the historical context of the scientific aspects or pseudoscientific aspects of race. And then we're going to take a look at a few sort of significant events in the early history of race as it pertains to Constitution. So a couple of quick things. Remember, anytime we're dealing with a particular unit or an issue, and we're dealing with the constitutionality of something, it's always good to go back to the source and just ask yourself the question, what does the Constitution say? And so let's take a look at that. So, of course, we know from the earliest days of our nation, even during the Revolutionary War, there were questions about the citizenship status and what would be the citizenship status. There were controversies about this. It was not everyone was in lockstep in the 1770s, 1780s on this issue, of course, and it didn't always break down easily north-south in those days. So, of course, that tempered the language of the Declaration of Independence, but of course, the Constitution as well. So, during the Revolutionary period, the Constitutional Convention, as you see, the provisions for federal emancipation were discarded in compromises in order to build consensus. We know this from a number of sources, the kind of language that's used in the Declaration of Independence and the drafts, and we also know from Madison's work on the Constitution, his notes that were taken about the Constitutional Convention and some of the disagreements that happened that ended in compromises. And so if America has done nothing in its history, it's compromised. It's a number of different views and beliefs coming together, and again, as Tom Hanks said, with one rule book. And so this is the rule book, and it's one that's designed to be pretty inclusive and to explain some of the things that we do stand for universally, although even those are, of course, compromises in some ways. All right. So what came of that, of course, was what's famously or infamously known as the 3/5 Compromise. In the Constitution, this one of the important things that was delineated is that every 10 years we have to have a census. We're in a census year in 2020. So what that means is it's not just for the sake of finding out demographics, which is interesting in and of itself. It's because we need to have proper apportionment. Apportionment is the ratio of population to the representatives in Congress. So because we don't have a pure democracy, we have a representative democracy or a republic, it's important to get the numbers right? So we don't want small groups of people having disproportionately greater say in Congress. We want it to be relatively fair. And so that's why we're doing the census this year, and we have every 10 years since the beginning. And so how to deal with slaves, how to deal with people who are not, citizens. And so in this particular case, they made up this compromise that for every 5 white voters, white citizens that could vote, blacks would count for 3 of that. So it's a wonky math by anyone's standard, but again, that's the nature of the compromise. So what that meant is, of course, blacks in the South, blacks all around could not vote, but slaves could not vote, but they did count for representation, which is highly problematic, which was never fully resolved until the late 19th century. That compromise was, again, distasteful to many people, wonky, although they wouldn't use the term wonky. It was irrational in some ways, and it was seen as disproportionately advantaging the South, if you think about that. So they get all this credit towards apportionment, but very few of those people, or none of the slaves, could vote, right? So a lot of people had a problem with that. So if you're asking yourself this question, how could good, well-meaning people believe that in this odd arrangement where these slaves could be used in these ways, not just in terms of free labor, that they could be forced to work as animals do, but then also that they would be treated constitutionally, legally in these odd ways as well, which are not, they're treating them as not fully humans in terms of voting and legal rights and things like that. The best analogy I have right now in the 21st century is this idea of fossil fuel addiction. So our civilization is addicted to fossil fuels. We're trying to wean ourselves off of that. But think about this, if you will. The same arguments apply to fossil fuel addiction as they did to slave labor. If you owned slaves in the 19th century, one of the arguments you might have is, again, a scientific one. Well, they're not the same as human beings as we understand them. They're kind of a different class. They're not advanced. They don't have the mental capacity for really being like me, for voting and for being abiding by the law, for example. They can't be free because they're not going to be, they're going to be like wild animals. That's, again, highly problematic and not scientific. But also this idea that okay, let's be practical about this. Let's just free the slaves overnight. First of all, our economy would collapse. There would be a crisis there. There's no way that that our economy would be maintained without this free labor. Everything's built around that. And there's no alternative. Now we're going to have to pay all these people, so it's a double whammy. Not only do we lose all that free labor, but now we have to pay people for all that labor we were used to. It would be a catastrophe economically. And that sounds a lot like our fossil fuel addiction, right? Well, what happens if we just suddenly don't use fossil fuels? It's going to be a catastrophe. Well, folks, we're in a catastrophe right now. Anyway, I just use that as a heuristic, just as a teaching device to kind of get us into that thinking of why good, well-meaning, smart people might have argued in favor of slavery, or at least argued against emancipation. And again, that's not to excuse it, it's just to help us to understand. So we turn to a couple other things here. So again, these things came to a head in the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, and as you know, probably, that this declaration was basically like an executive order from President Lincoln in a time of war, another time of crisis. And this was a de jure emancipation of all slaves, a legal emancipation, like removing people from the slaves. But it was really only in Confederate and border states. So it was limited, believe it or not. It wasn't a universal proclamation, but even that was pretty controversial, even in the North. But what's interesting about that is it galvanized the Civil War. It clarified that this is one of the major reasons for the Civil War. It's not so much about these fuzzy discussions about economics. It's not really about states' rights. It's about what's right, who a human being is, what does it mean to be an American, what are our natural rights. And so all those intellectual conflicts that came out of the Enlightenment that were not fully resolved were resolved by the shedding of mass amounts of blood and huge amounts of pain and suffering in the 1860s. It was a moral purging, as many historians have seen it since. So the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, this is a period of about 12 years, which has a fascinating history. We could do an entire course on Reconstruction, but I'm not going to right here. Was an attempt to kind of enforce the winners, in this case, the Unionists, those in the North, to impose these federal standards on Southern states. In other words, to say, yes, you still have sovereignty, but you blew it, folks. And now what you have to do is abide by all the standards of the Constitution, not just cherry picking them and saying, well, our states can determine our own destiny. You say, well, the federal government is ultimately sovereign in some cases, but not in all. And we see what are called the Reconstruction Amendments. And again, we're looking to ask the question, what do we know in American history to help us understand the status of whites and blacks, right? Where does it actually say something about that? And so, again, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and Amendments 13, 14, and 15. We start to see, after Reconstruction, there's this wonky end to Reconstruction, which is bizarre in the election of 1876. I can put a link there if I can in Moodle for you to read up a little bit more about this. But basically, the feds left the South, and what that meant is not just a power vacuum in the South, but a backlash against that. And these are what we call the Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws are just a fascinating, checkered, and terrible history by most people's accounts of what happened over the next 50 years or so. So the backlash, again, in a very short story here, and I'm just simplifying a lot of this, is really for the next 100 years. Think the 1860s into the 1960s, when we see the civil rights era really start to ramp up. We see the growth of groups like the KKK, and they saw themselves as white crusaders, presuming to take action on behalf of Christianity, democracy, and racial purity. Now, I put the word conflation there to explain what's going on here. A number of people in this backlash, largely in the South, but not just in the South, white Americans, poor and rich, took this, again, a pseudoscientific view that it would be unnatural to allow blacks to have these kind of freedoms. It goes against God's law, many people were arguing, to allow blacks to be as free and empowered as whites. And I'm giving them the best possible argument there. You know, there's some terrible arguments as well that came out over that century. But the word conflation means blending two or three or more ideas together under the same umbrella. So you see there Christianity as a whole complicated system of belief and practice based on the worship of Jesus Christ. Then you have democracy, right? This idea of empowerment, individuals being involved in the destiny of their government, and this other third concept, racial purity, which is sometimes pseudoscientific, sometimes it's just by tradition, sometimes it's just biased in ignorance. And what you see is a conflation of putting together these three concepts over the past 100+ years. So you start to see rallies like this, which I don't know if this image is a trigger for any of you, but there are cross burnings and this sort of blending of the flag and the cross and racial purity and actually kind of a public acknowledgement of this. The KKK in 1925, they were marching in Washington, and not with angry fist bumps, but peacefully as white crusaders, quote unquote, to show the best of America. And you know, again, I'm giving you the best possible argument there. There are some terrible reasons why people join the KKK as well, that have a terrible, violent underbelly. But you also see this is a pretty contemporary publication by the KKK in which they say, "Make America Great Again." And "Make America Great Again" from this perspective means Christian, means democratic, and it means white. So definitely this kind of sense of white superiority that combines these ideas problematically, probably for many of us, that we might reject just viscerally, if not intellectually. These are some of those very, very strong undercurrents in this narrative that has so shaped what it means to be American in the past 200 years. So I want to pause there, and I'm going to put together another video here in which we take a look at Plessy versus Ferguson and the Brown versus Board of Education, which we expand on these ideas. Oh, by the way, I haven't read this issue of The Crusader. I've never read it, but I do see in the top there it's by a pastor. So take that for what it's worth. Anyway, thank you so much, and we'll take a look at the next video in just a moment.